April 15, 1945, outskirts of Nuremberg, Germany. When the Allied tanks rolled through the smoldering remnants of the Third Reich, they left behind not just weapons and ruins, but invisible people, prisoners, women, children. Among them was Greta, who at 19 years old had learned that survival meant obedience and silence. But when the American Sherman tanks appeared on the horizon, a new dilemma began. Would this be liberation or just another kind of captivity? Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen forgotten stories. The morning air still carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning wood. Greta pressed herself against the cold concrete wall of what had been a military facility, her threadbare dress offering little protection against the April chill. Through the broken windows, she could hear the rumble of engines growing closer, different engines with a different rhythm than the German vehicles she had grown to fear. For 18 months, she and dozens of other young women had been confined here under the euphemistic designation of comfort personnel. The reality was far grimmer than the clinical terminology suggested. They were prisoners in all but name, their movements restricted, their lives controlled by military bureaucracy that treated them as inventory rather than human beings. The facility had once housed administrative offices for a Wehrmacht supply depot. Now it served as a holding area for women who had been categorized as essential personnel for troop morale. The classification was deliberately vague, designed to obscure the true nature of their circumstances. Most had arrived through coercion, economic desperation, false promises of employment, or outright deception about their intended roles. Greta clutched a small leather journal she had managed to keep hidden throughout her ordeal. Its pages contained fragments of her former life, pressed flowers from her family's garden in Bavaria, addresses of relatives she hoped were still alive, and carefully coded observations about her daily existence. The journal represented the only continuity between who she had been and who she was forced to become. The sound of boots on gravel grew louder. German voices shouted orders, then fell silent. Vehicle doors slammed, then new voices, speaking English with American accents. Greta's heart hammered as she tried to process what this meant. The Americans had finally arrived at their location. After months of hearing distant artillery and whispered rumors about Allied advances, liberation was literally at their doorstep. But liberation from what exactly? And liberation into what kind of future? These questions haunted every woman in the facility. They had been isolated from news of the outside world, dependent entirely on their captors for information about the war's progress. Now, suddenly, everything was changing with terrifying speed. Through the window, Greta caught her first glimpse of American soldiers. They moved with a different bearing than German troops, more casual in their formations but alert and professional. Their uniforms were cleaner, better maintained. They carried themselves like men who expected to return home rather than face a last desperate stand. The facility's German commander, Oberst Müller, emerged from his office with his hands raised. His usually pristine uniform was disheveled, and his face bore the expression of a man watching his world collapse. The Americans accepted his surrender with minimal ceremony, more focused on securing the area than on dramatic gestures. What struck Greta most forcefully was the absence of immediate chaos. She had expected violence, confusion, perhaps retribution. Instead, the Americans methodically went about their business of taking control. They posted guards, established communication with their command, and began the process of documenting what they had found. When American medics arrived to assess the health of the facility's occupants, Greta experienced her first direct contact with her liberators. The young sergeant who examined her spoke in broken German, his manner professional but kind. He offered her a blanket and asked if she needed medical attention. The simple courtesy of being asked, rather than told, felt almost foreign after months of being treated as property. That first night under American protection, Greta lay awake listening to the sounds of a military camp settling into routine. But instead of the harsh barked orders and threatening atmosphere she had grown accustomed to, she heard quiet conversations, occasional laughter, and the reassuring rhythm of organized activity rather than arbitrary control. The liberation had begun, but Greta and her fellow prisoners were about to discover that freedom was more complicated than simply changing which army controlled their fate. The morning brought American coffee and white bread, luxuries that seemed almost mythical after years of ersatz substitutes and meager rations. Lieutenant James Harrison, a soft-spoken officer from Ohio, had been assigned to oversee the civilian population recovered from the facility. His approach was markedly different from what the women had experienced under German administration. "Ladies," he announced in carefully pronounced German, "you are no longer prisoners. You are displaced persons under American protection." The words carried weight that went beyond their literal meaning. For the first time in months, someone was addressing them as individuals with rights, rather than as resources to be managed. But protection proved more complex than Harrison's declaration suggested. Within hours of the American takeover, problems emerged that tested the boundaries of liberation. Local German civilians, emboldened by the chaos of defeat and desperate for scapegoats, began gathering near the facility. Their accusations were whispered but venomous. The women were collaborators, traitors who had consorted with the enemy willingly. Greta witnessed the first confrontation through the window of what had become an improvised mess hall. A group of German townswomen had approached the American guards, demanding that those shameless creatures be turned over to face proper German justice. Their spokesman, a middle-aged woman whose husband had died on the Russian front, gestured angrily toward the building where Greta and the others were housed. What happened next surprised everyone, including the American soldiers themselves. Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a combat veteran from Boston, stepped forward to address the German civilians. His words were translated by a German-speaking corporal, but his meaning was unmistakable even without translation. "These women are under United States Army protection," he declared firmly. "Anyone attempting to interfere with them will answer to military authority." When the German spokeswoman protested that local customs and justice should prevail, O'Brien's response was uncompromising. "Ma'am, local justice is what got this whole country into trouble in the first place." The confrontation established a pattern that would define the following weeks. American soldiers, many of whom had limited understanding of the complex circumstances that had led to the women's situation, nonetheless recognized their fundamental responsibility to protect vulnerable civilians. This protection extended beyond mere physical safety to defending the women's dignity against public harassment and intimidation. Private Danny Rodriguez from New Mexico had grown up in a community where protecting women from abuse was considered a basic obligation of decent men. When he saw German civilians spitting at Greta as she walked to the medical tent, his reaction was immediate and decisive. He didn't need to understand the political complexities or historical context. He simply saw a young woman being mistreated and intervened. "Back off," he told the harassers, positioning himself between them and Greta. "Find something else to do with your time." His tone was calm, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The civilians retreated, muttering complaints about American interference in German affairs. These small acts of protection accumulated into something larger and more significant. The American soldiers were, often without fully realizing it, establishing a new social order based on different principles than those that had governed the facility under German control. They were creating a space where the women could begin to recover some sense of personal agency and dignity. Lieutenant Harrison began conducting individual interviews with each woman to document their experiences and determine their needs for repatriation or relocation. These conversations, conducted through interpreters and marked by considerable cultural and linguistic barriers, nonetheless represented the first time in months that the women had been asked about their own wishes and circumstances. Greta's interview took place in what had been the commander's office, now stripped of its intimidating Nazi paraphernalia and furnished with simple American field furniture. Harrison's questions were direct but respectful. Where was she from? Did she have family to return to? What kind of assistance did she need to rebuild her life? For Greta, the opportunity to speak about her own situation felt almost overwhelming. She had become so accustomed to having her circumstances dictated by others that being asked to express preferences and make choices required conscious effort. The simple act of being treated as someone whose opinions mattered was itself a form of healing. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know how far and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. The protection offered by American soldiers extended beyond formal military procedures to personal gestures of respect and kindness. When Corporal James Thompson noticed that Greta had been wearing the same worn dress for days, he quietly arranged for her to receive clothing from supplies intended for displaced persons. When she tried to thank him, he simply said, "Everyone deserves clean clothes, miss. No need to thank me for basic decency. These interactions began to restore something that had been systematically eroded during the women's captivity, the sense that they were worthy of consideration and respect. The American soldiers' protection was creating psychological as well as physical safety, allowing the women to begin contemplating a future beyond mere survival. But challenges remained. The local German population's hostility showed no signs of abating, and the women's legal status remained uncertain. They were free from their previous captivity, but their path to genuine independence was still unclear. The Americans could offer protection and temporary shelter, but long-term solutions would require navigating complex questions of law, politics, and social reconstruction in a defeated nation. As night fell on their second day of American protection, Greta found herself cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. The soldiers guarding their quarters were there to protect, rather than confine them. The difference was subtle but profound, and it was beginning to make all the difference in how she viewed her chances for reclaiming her life. The third day brought visitors that would complicate the simple narrative of liberation. A convoy of military vehicles arrived carrying American military police, army chaplains, and civilian officials tasked with investigating war crimes and processing displaced persons. Among them was Captain Patricia Wells, one of the few female officers in the theater, whose presence immediately changed the dynamics within the facility. Captain Wells had volunteered for overseas duty specifically to work with women affected by the war. Her background in social work and her fluency in German made her uniquely qualified to assess the complex situations she encountered. But even her experience had not prepared her for the particular circumstances of the comfort personnel facilities. Her first meeting with the women took place in the facility's former library, now cleared of its propaganda materials and furnished with chairs arranged in a circle. Wells addressed them in fluent German, explaining that she was there to help determine their needs and facilitate their return to normal life. But she also made clear that this process would require them to provide detailed accounts of their experiences, accounts that might be used in legal proceedings against their former captors. Greta found herself selected as an unofficial spokesperson for the group, partly because of her education, and partly because she had maintained better psychological resilience than some of her fellow prisoners. The responsibility felt both honoring and burdensome. She would be speaking not just for herself, but for women whose voices had been silenced by trauma or fear. The interview process revealed the complexity of their situation in ways that challenged simple categories of victim and perpetrator. Some women had indeed been coerced into their roles through direct force or deception. Others had made choices under circumstances of such limited options that the distinction between consent and coercion became philosophically and legally problematic. Captain Wells listened to these accounts with professional sympathy, but Greta could see the weight of judgment in her expressions. The American officer was clearly struggling to reconcile her preconceptions about victimhood with the nuanced realities she was hearing. Some of the women's stories didn't fit neatly into categories that would satisfy military tribunals or civilian courts seeking clear distinctions between innocence and guilt. Meanwhile, the protective posture of the American soldiers was being tested by increasing pressure from multiple directions. German civilian authorities, now cooperating with Allied occupation forces, were demanding that the women be turned over for denazification proceedings. They argued that anyone who had served the Nazi military apparatus, regardless of circumstances, needed to be processed through civilian courts according to German law. Sergeant O'Brien found himself in heated discussions with American military lawyers about the extent of his authority to protect the women. The lawyers pointed out that military protection could not indefinitely shield civilian personnel from legal processes, especially when those processes were being conducted by Allied-approved German authorities. "With respect, sir," O'Brien told the Army Council, "these ladies have been through enough without us throwing them to the wolves just because some bureaucrat needs to check boxes on legal forms." His blunt assessment reflected the sentiment of many soldiers who had witnessed the women's circumstances firsthand. The tension came to a head when a delegation of German officials arrived with paperwork demanding custody of 6 women, including Greta, for interrogation about their activities during the war. The officials were accompanied by American military police who had been ordered to facilitate the transfer as part of broader cooperation agreements with German civilian authorities. Lieutenant Harrison found himself caught between conflicting orders and his personal conviction that transferring the women would expose them to persecution disguised as justice. His solution was characteristically American. He requested clarification from higher authority and delayed the transfer pending receipt of specific written orders. During this bureaucratic reprieve, something unexpected happened. The American soldiers began advocating actively for the women's protection, writing letters to their commanders and even to representatives back home. Corporal Thompson composed a detailed account of what he had witnessed, arguing that the women deserved protection rather than prosecution. "These girls didn't start this war," he wrote to his congressman. "They got caught up in something bigger than them, and now they're being blamed for decisions made by men in Berlin they never met. Seems to me we ought to be helping them get their lives back together, not making their situation worse." Private Rodriguez organized his fellow soldiers to pool resources for purchasing supplies the women needed: soap, clothing, writing materials. When questioned by his sergeant about the appropriateness of such personal involvement, Rodriguez's response was simple. "My mother raised me to help people in trouble, Sarge. These ladies are in trouble." Captain Wells found herself increasingly aligned with the soldiers' protective stance, despite her initial inclination toward formal legal processing. Her interviews had revealed that the women's situations were far more complex than standard legal categories could accommodate. Most had been victims of circumstances that reduced their choices to variations of compliance or resistance that would have resulted in death or deportation to concentration camps. The legal complexity was compounded by the broader context of German society's collapse and reconstruction. Many of the civilians demanding justice for the women had themselves been complicit in various aspects of the Nazi system. Their moral authority to judge others was questionable at best. Greta observed these developments with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The Americans' protection was genuine and effective, but it highlighted the precarious nature of her situation. She was dependent on the goodwill of foreign soldiers who might be transferred or reassigned at any time. Her long-term security required finding a path to genuine independence rather than continued reliance on protection. The standoff over the custody demands forced all parties to confront fundamental questions about justice, mercy, and the meaning of liberation. Were the women victims deserving protection or collaborators requiring prosecution? Could they be both? And who had the moral and legal authority to make such determinations in the chaos of post-war Germany? As the sun set on another day of uncertainty, Greta reflected in her journal about the strange position she found herself in, protected by enemies who had become protectors, threatened by compatriots who viewed her as a traitor. The Americans had given her safety, but they could not give her absolution from a society determined to find scapegoats for its collective shame. The next day would bring new challenges that would test whether American protection could withstand the combined pressures of legal bureaucracy, political expediency, and the complex demands of justice in a morally compromised world. Dawn brought news that changed everything. A reporter from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, had arrived to investigate reports of American soldiers protecting German women from civilian persecution. Sergeant Mike O'Brien watched the jeep pull up with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Publicity could either strengthen their position or expose them to criticism for exceeding their authority. The reporter, Staff Sergeant Bill Matthews, was a former Chicago newspaperman whose combat reporting had earned respect throughout the European theater. He approached the story with professional skepticism, but his interviews with both soldiers and the women quickly revealed the complexity of the situation they faced. "What we have here," Matthews wrote in his notes, "is American soldiers instinctively doing what they believe is right, even when regulations and politics suggest they should do otherwise." His article, published 3 days later, would spark debates in Washington about the moral obligations of occupying forces towards civilian populations. Meanwhile, the pressure for transferring custody of the women intensified. Colonel Robert Harrison, Lieutenant Harrison's superior officer, arrived with explicit orders to comply with German civilian authorities' demands. The colonel was a by-the-book officer who viewed his subordinates' protective stance as insubordination that could undermine broader Allied cooperation agreements. "Lieutenant," Colonel Harrison told his nephew during a tense private meeting, "your personal feelings about these women cannot override military policy. We have agreements with German authorities that must be honored, regardless of your assessment of their motivations or competence." But Lieutenant Harrison had been conducting his own investigation into the German officials demanding custody. Working with Captain Wells and Army intelligence personnel, he had discovered that several of the officials had themselves held significant positions in the Nazi administrative apparatus. Their sudden enthusiasm for justice appeared motivated more by self-preservation than genuine concern for accountability. This revelation provided legal grounds for questioning the transfer orders. Under Allied directives, former Nazi officials were themselves subject to denazification proceedings and could not exercise judicial authority until their own cases were resolved. Lieutenant Harrison formally challenged the custody demands on these grounds, buying additional time while higher authorities reviewed the situation. The delay allowed Captain Wells to complete her comprehensive interviews with all the women. Her report, submitted to Army headquarters, painted a detailed picture of systematic coercion operating under the cover of legal military procedures. Most of the women had been recruited through false promises of legitimate employment, then trapped by regulations that made departure impossible without official permission that was never granted. Greta's testimony proved particularly compelling because of her education and her ability to articulate the psychological dimensions of their captivity. She described how the system had been designed to erode the women's sense of personal agency gradually, making resistance seem futile while maintaining the fiction that they were voluntary participants in military support operations. They never had to use chains, she told Captain Wells. The chains were made of paperwork, regulations, and the threat of being classified as deserters or traitors if we attempted to leave. We were prisoners who were told we were employees, which somehow made our captivity our own fault. The American soldiers' protective response to the women's situation was becoming a test case for broader questions about occupation policy and moral responsibility. Were American forces obligated simply to maintain order and facilitate legal processes, regardless of the justice of those processes? Or did their victory over Nazism carry moral obligations that transcended bureaucratic procedures? Sergeant O'Brien found himself articulating this dilemma in terms that reflected his Irish Catholic background. We didn't fight this war just to replace German bullies with American bureaucrats. We fought it because we believe some things are right and some things are wrong, and protecting innocent people from persecution is right, no matter what the paperwork says. The soldiers' letters home were beginning to reach American newspapers, creating public attention that complicated the military's desire to handle the situation quietly. An editorial in the Boston Globe praised American boys who remember that liberation means protecting the weak, not just changing flags. Similar pieces appeared in papers across the country, creating political pressure for policies that supported the soldiers' protective stance. Private Rodriguez received a letter from his mother that he shared with his fellow soldiers. "Mijo, you do what you know is right. Your father and I didn't raise you to turn your back on people in trouble just because some officer tells you it's not your business. Those girls need protection. You protect them." The breakthrough came when Captain Wells's investigation revealed documentary evidence that the facility had been operating in violation of German military regulations as well as international law. Records hidden by the previous commander showed that the women had been classified officially as voluntary auxiliary personnel, but internal documents revealed the coercive methods used to maintain their compliance. This evidence provided legal justification for American intervention in the custody dispute. The German officials demanding transfer were seeking to prosecute the women under laws that the facility's own operations had violated. The logical inconsistency was so glaring that even the colonel found it difficult to justify compliance with the transfer demands. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps the story of Greta and her fellow survivors reach more people. The resolution came through an unexpected channel. The Stars and Stripes article had reached American military headquarters in Berlin, where it came to the attention of General Lucius Clay, the American military governor. Clay ordered a comprehensive review of policies regarding displaced persons who had been forced into roles supporting German military operations. The general's directive established new guidelines that prioritized protection and rehabilitation over prosecution for individuals who could demonstrate they had been coerced into cooperation with Nazi authorities. The policy explicitly recognized that formal consent obtained under duress was not legally valid, regardless of documentation, suggesting voluntary participation. For Greta and her fellow survivors, this policy shift meant the difference between persecution and protection. But more than that, it validated the moral instincts of soldiers who had risked their careers to do what they believed was right. The American military had officially endorsed the principle that liberation meant protecting the vulnerable, not just following bureaucratic procedures. The German officials who had demanded custody found themselves subject to their own denazification proceedings. Several were removed from office when their wartime activities were revealed. The irony was lost on no one. The accusers had become the accused, while their intended victims found safety under American protection. As night fell, Greta wrote in her journal about the strange turns her life had taken. She had been saved not by laws or policies, but by individual soldiers who had chosen to act according to their conscience, rather than their orders. Their moral courage had not only protected her, it had helped reshape American policy toward thousands of other displaced persons throughout occupied Germany. 3 months after liberation, the facility had been transformed into a genuine displaced persons camp, operated according to international humanitarian standards. Greta stood in what had once been the commander's office, now converted into a classroom where she taught English to other displaced persons preparing for emigration to America or other allied countries. The irony was not lost on her that she was now helping others navigate the same process of reconstruction she was still experiencing herself, but teaching gave her a sense of purpose and agency that had been absent during her months of captivity. More importantly, it allowed her to transform her survival into service for others facing similar challenges. Lieutenant Harrison had been promoted to captain and reassigned to a larger displaced persons operation in Munich, but he maintained correspondence with the women he had protected. His final report on the facility had become a model for American policy towards similar situations throughout occupied Europe. The principle he had helped establish, that protection of vulnerable civilians superseded bureaucratic convenience, was now official doctrine. Captain Wells had requested extended duty in Germany to continue her work with displaced women. Her comprehensive study of coercive recruitment practices had contributed to war crimes prosecutions and influenced new international laws regarding the protection of civilians during military occupations. She had found in the women's stories not just individual tragedies, but systematic patterns that demanded institutional responses. The soldiers who had risked their careers to protect the women had become heroes in their units and in their hometowns. Sergeant O'Brien received a commendation for exemplary moral leadership under difficult circumstances. His response was characteristically blunt. "I didn't do anything special. I just remembered what my mother taught me about treating people right." Private Rodriguez had been accepted for officer candidate school, partly on the strength of recommendations from his commanders, who praised his moral courage and leadership potential. His letters home continue to describe his work, helping displaced persons, reflecting his commitment to service that extended beyond military obligations. The reporter Bill Matthews had won a journalism award for his coverage of the story, but more importantly, his articles had helped change American public opinion about displaced persons and occupation policies. His follow-up stories documented the successful rehabilitation of hundreds of women who had been protected by American intervention rather than turned over to potentially hostile civilian authorities. Greta herself had received offers to immigrate to the United States, sponsored by American families who had read about her story. After careful consideration, she had chosen to accept a position with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, working to establish programs for displaced persons throughout Europe. Her experience had given her unique insights into the challenges faced by people rebuilding their lives after systematic victimization. The transformation was visible in small details that accumulated into larger changes. The facility's walls, once covered with Nazi propaganda, now displayed artwork created by residents in therapy programs. The mess hall, where women had once eaten in fearful silence, now buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as people planned their futures and shared their hopes. The German civilians who had initially demanded the women's prosecution had largely retreated from their hostile stance. Some had been forced to confront their own complicity in the system that had victimized the women. Others had simply moved on to other concerns as the immediate chaos of defeat gave way to the long process of reconstruction. But the most significant change was in the women themselves. The fearful, defeated individuals who had been liberated by American tanks had gradually reclaimed their sense of personal agency and dignity. They spoke of plans and dreams rather than simply surviving from day to day. They had rediscovered the possibility of hope. Greta's journal, once a secret repository of hidden thoughts and coded observations, had become a public document. Excerpts had been published in American magazines and European newspapers, helping readers understand the human cost of systems that reduced individuals to administrative categories. Her words had given voice to experiences that might otherwise have remained hidden in classified military files. The legal precedents established by the case had influenced occupation policies throughout Germany and Japan. The principle that protection of vulnerable civilians superseded administrative convenience had been incorporated into military training and international law. Future occupying forces would be better prepared to recognize and respond to similar situations. On a practical level, the women had received comprehensive medical care, psychological counseling, and vocational training that prepared them for independent lives. Many had been reunited with surviving family members. Others had chosen to emigrate to countries offering fresh starts. All had been given choices, rather than having their futures determined by bureaucratic processes. The American soldiers who had protected them had learned lessons that would influence their entire lives. They had discovered that moral courage sometimes required acting against official policies, and that individual conscience could sometimes serve justice better than institutional procedures. These lessons would shape their behavior as veterans and citizens in post-war America. The story had also influenced American domestic policy. Veterans returning home brought with them first-hand knowledge of displacement and persecution that made them advocates for refugee assistance and civil rights. The moral clarity they had developed in protecting vulnerable people overseas translated into support for protecting vulnerable people at home. For Greta, the most profound change was psychological. She had moved from being someone to whom things happened to someone who made things happen. Her survival had become the foundation for service to others facing similar challenges. The victim had become an advocate, the survivor had become a leader. As she prepared to leave for her new position with the UN, Greta reflected on the unlikely chain of events that had brought her from captivity to purpose. She had been saved by foreign soldiers who had chosen to act according to conscience rather than convenience. Their moral courage had not only protected her, it had helped her discover her own capacity for courage and service. The facility that had once symbolized her powerlessness had become the launching point for a career devoted to protecting others from similar experiences. The Americans had given her safety, but she had discovered within herself the strength to transform that safety into service for others who needed protection. Her final entry in the journal that had sustained her through captivity was simple but profound. I have learned that liberation is not something that happens to you. It is something you choose to do for yourself and others every day for the rest of your life. Now I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and share a comment about which part of this documented story impacted you most. These historical accounts need to be remembered and shared so that the courage of those who protected the vulnerable is never forgotten.